What you remember, I hope, is that we've seen in task discussion groups like the Bales groups that inequality emerges in terms of how much people participate. Some participate a lot, some participate very little. And how much a person participates is a good predictor of how much other people talk to him or her, and a good predictor of how other people rate him or her in terms of various things having to do with leadership, ability, organization skills, knowledge of the task, things like that. So the inequality that emerges, besides being very, very predictable, is also useful information because it tells you how much influence each person has in the group's task, or how much influence each person has in terms of what the group decides. So we're going to try to construct an explanation for that, and the explanation should apply to the Bales groups you've already seen, as well as to groups that you'll see next week and the week after that, and things like that. The explanation should have scope conditions, because no explanation applies to everything. If somebody says, what's the scope of your explanation, what the person is asking is, what sorts of situations does your explanation apply to? So we want to make sure that we're clear, we're only trying to explain what happens in certain sorts of situations. And we will explain the 4 generalizations that I hope you have remembered from last week and the week before. I'm going to talk about what theoretical constructs are. It's a term that's useful here, and you'll probably see it in other courses. And all I want to do there is to give you a quick familiarity with it. Then we'll have a theoretical explanation. Next week we'll apply the explanation. And week 6 we'll elaborate the explanation. And then we'll have all of the theoretical foundations that we need for the rest of the course. That's my goal. If it sounds like we're reaching it, tell me. And if it doesn't sound like we're reaching it, it's even more important to tell me. If I say something that doesn't remind you of any of that there, that's the time to say, could you go back and tell me why you're doing that? So we want to analyze problem solution in these groups. These are all problem-solving groups. And we want to think about it as a series of acts, or what Bales called initiations. That is, as they're solving their problem and as they're discussing, since these are discussion groups, think about those as being a whole series, a long series of actions. In this case, meaning what people say. We want to develop the theoretical context for the interaction in task-focused, collectively oriented groups. And then we want to explain the abstract propositions that we had last week. Scope of the explanation. Remember I said the explanation only applies to certain kinds of situations. It applies to situations that are task-focused and collectively oriented. What does it mean to say a situation is task-focused?
Trying to come up with a solution.
Good. Their main reason for getting together is to solve a problem. Yes. And you can think of groups that are not task-focused, right? Where they get together because they enjoy each other's company, for instance. These are groups where the reason that they are together is to work on something. They want to come up with an answer to something. You remember in the Bales groups, they were given a human relations problem. Should this couple go to counseling? Should this couple break up? Should they try to talk it out? That kind of thing. That's the reason that the groups are together. And the committee that you worked on last week for your paper was a task-focused committee. They got together because they had to come up with a solution to the problem of how long it takes to get to class. And second, yeah. So their primary motive is to solve a task. The other kind of group would be a social emotional group where the reason they get together is because they enjoy each other's company or they benefit from each other's company. Group therapy, for instance, is a social emotional group, where the reason you go to group therapy is to benefit from the interaction process. You want to say something?
Okay, so that's considered task focused also on the social emotional.
No, social emotional groups are not task focused. That's the other kind, the complementary kind.
Okay, I was just wondering if it fell under task focused. Okay.
It says compare it to social emotional focus.
Was that what that means?
Of course. And they're collectively oriented, which means it's a group task. Everybody should contribute to it. Everybody should participate in the solution. And everybody should agree on whatever the solution is that they come up with. So not only are they task focused, but they are collectively oriented, which means everybody has to be involved in solving this problem. And once they have come to a solution, they have to be sure that everybody buys into it. And I think if you are familiar with what a jury does, think about them as being, they're not only task focused, they're collectively oriented. They have to agree on the verdict. That's a very collectively oriented group. The opposite of that would be individual orientation. So you can imagine a group of people who are working on, I don't know, some sort of exam in the same room. Everybody comes up with different answers. Or imagine people working on a situation where some of them think the answer should be this, some of them think the answer should be that. Those guys are not collectively oriented, they're individually oriented. But the idea here is the group gets together because we want to solve a problem, and we're all going to work together on it, and we're all going to work until we agree we've got a good solution. Got that for scope? The 4 principles that we have to explain, you've got them in your notes probably from last week, but I just want to say a couple of words about them. First of all, in groups that are task-focused and collectively oriented, you will always find participation inequality. Some people do a lot of participation, some people do very little, and you can see it very quickly. And as the group gets bigger, the amount of inequality increases. You remember when I had those instances of Bales groups of different size and how much inequality you'd see? As the group gets bigger, the amount of inequality increases. So in a group of, say, 12 people, like a jury, there's going to be 2 or 3 people whose participation occurs maybe 2 or 3% of the time. And there'll be somebody who participates a lot, maybe 45 to 50% of the time. That's what I mean. As the group gets bigger, the inequality increases. Second, it's reciprocal. If you rank them on how much they talk, you've also ranked them on how much they're talked to. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that how much they're talking is a function of how much other people are talking to them. It's not that I like to talk a lot, and so I'm going to talk a lot in this group. No, it's I'm talking a lot because other people are encouraging me to talk a lot. Or I'm not talking very much, even though I'd like to, because other people are discouraging me from talking a lot. Got those two? So, together, these tell us there's inequality, and the inequality is being produced by all the members of the group. It's not imposed from the outside. It has very little to do with the personalities of the people involved, but it has to do with how they treat each other. Any questions on those two? I hope you're thinking of how you could explain them. Third thing we always see in these groups is, I call it consistency. Remember, in a lot of cases, Bales administered questionnaires. Who had the best ideas, who had the most ability, who did the most to organize the group and keep things moving. Well, if you rank the members on those items, you'll find that ranking correlates very much with how much they talk. So that begins to give us an idea of why they're encouraging some people and discouraging others. They're trying to encourage the people who they think has good ideas. and they're trying to discourage the people who have bad ideas. Why do they want to discourage those people? Because they're task focused. They are there to solve a problem. They're not there because they like talking to these people. It's a task focused group. And finally, persistence. Once you've got this inequality, which in a discussion group takes maybe 10 minutes to emerge, once you've got this inequality, it tends to persist throughout the meeting. So if you look at the inequality in participation, say, at the end of 10 minutes, and then look at it again at the end of 60 minutes, the inequality that you saw at the end of 10 minutes is very close to the inequality you see at the end of 60 minutes. So 4 things that we will try to explain. Inequality, reciprocity, consistency, and persistence. Because of all of those inequalities and the fact that they tend to be so highly correlated, we can talk about the group's power and prestige structure. Some people are influential, other people are not. Some people are thought to be very useful to the group, other people are not. So it's a combination of influence and perceived value. That's what I'm talking about when I say we're talking about a power and prestige group, a structure of the group. And it seems to be it's a single inequality structure. Power and prestige can be measured in a lot of ways. The easiest way to measure is how much they're talking, but you could do it by questionnaires or by interviewing them or a lot of other things. Whatever it is, it seems to be unidimensional. That is, there's only one structure there. And there's various components of the power and prestige structure. There's behavioral ones, like how much they talk, how much they praise each other. And there's attitudinal ones, who I think has the best ideas in the group. So what's happening then in groups that meet these scope conditions is they're developing a power and prestige structure. And I hope you'll remember the term power and prestige structure so we can talk about it later. What we want to explain is, what is it about interaction in task-focused, collectively oriented groups that impels them to develop a power and prestige structure? And once they develop it, to maintain it. Scope conditions. Task-focused, collectively oriented. Remember that? Okay. Components of the inequality structure: participation rates, receipt rates, evaluations, influence, perceptions of ability, choices for leadership, perceived value to the group, and a lot of other things. I posted these for you. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to have you photograph it, but...
I didn't see them online.
Aren't they there? Sometimes I take out a couple of things, but not a lot. Abstractly, meaning that's what we're looking to explain. Concretely, how often each person talks. You can talk about, count those, how often each person is talked to. When you hear people say good idea, bad idea, I agree. Okay, your way sounds better. That means I've accepted influence from you. I still think my way is better. That means I'm rejecting influence from you. You tried to influence me, it didn't work. Perceptions of ability, choices for leadership, value to the group, all of those things. So those are the way we can see the power and prestige structure. I think it helps if you think about the group's job in terms of their main task and their subtasks. The main task is to solve the problem, whatever it is. If it's a jury, they've got to make a decision about guilt or non-guilt. If it's a committee, they've got to make a decision about how to get people to classes faster on campus. There's all kinds of things that they have to do, but whatever their main task is to solve the group problem. And for that, everybody has to contribute because it's a collectively oriented group. But they don't have to contribute equally. In fact, you don't want them to contribute equally. You want the people who are useful to contribute a lot. The people who are not, you'd like them to be less participatory. Then they have a subtask. And the subtask is to benefit from valuable contributions. If you're in a group like this, and you know not everybody can talk all the time, what you really want to do is to figure out who's going to be useful when he talks and who's going to be useless or worse when they don't. You don't want to waste time, you don't want to be misled, but you do want to benefit from whoever knows how to do it. So it's as though people probably don't consciously say, I've got to figure out who's useful here, but they very quickly realize we've got to solve this problem at some point so we can go home. And one of the things I need to figure out is who can get us to the answer quickly and who's going to waste time. And they have an interactional task, which is to encourage some people to discourage other people. And you've got to maintain a certain amount of solidarity, meaning you have to be careful not to antagonize people so much that they withdraw psychologically or physically. That's actually not as big a problem as it might seem like, but it's always there. If they can do this, the group functions efficiently. Remember the study of boards of directors, where the researchers found that boards of directors could make decisions more quickly and make better decisions if they developed an inequality structure. Because when they were all equal in power and prestige, the group just argued and wasted time. So sometimes at the very beginning you see what Bales called a status struggle. You have a discussion group, you put together a bunch of competitive students, everybody's trying to talk a lot. Okay, that's what happens in the first few minutes. Eventually they work it out. So the subtask, the interactional task, are what produce the power and prestige structure. Make sense? Thanks. Got some new terminology for us now. And I don't think you need to learn it today, but I hope you'll remember it because we're going to use it in the future. The first is the idea of action opportunities. An action opportunity means you're getting a chance to perform, a socially distributed chance to perform. So if I say, what do you think we ought to do? I'm giving you an action opportunity. Or, does anybody have any suggestions for this problem? That's giving an action opportunity to the group. It looks sort of like Bales category 7 through 9. Not exactly, but you remember those were asks for orientation, information, ask for opinion, evaluation, analysis, and ask for suggestions. So an action opportunity really is giving somebody else a chance to perform. It's a socially distributed chance to perform. You know what those are now. You'd recognize one if you saw it. Because if you don't, please tell me. I want to spend more time on it. Second is a performance output, which is a problem-solving attempt. A performance output means somebody says, I think the answer is this, or I suggest we break the problem down into small components, or this will work better if you work on this part and she works on that part. It's pretty much like Bales categories 4 through 6. Not exactly, but sort of close. Gives a suggestion, direction, implying authority for the other. Gives an opinion or an evaluation or analysis. or gives orientation information, repeats the task, clarifies the problem. So a performance output is an attempt to move the group closer to solution. And of course, if somebody gives an action opportunity, it's very likely, but not guaranteed, that the person who is given it will make a performance output. You're in a group like this and somebody says, how do you think we ought to approach it? The person is likely to look at it. Action opportunities are words, and sometimes they're simply, you pause and you look at somebody else and wait. That's giving the person a chance to perform. Performance outputs, attempts to solve the problem. Unit evaluation always follows a performance output. Anytime somebody tries to move the group towards solution, we think everybody evaluates it. They may evaluate it publicly by saying, good idea, bad idea, I don't think that's quite right. Or they may just evaluate it privately and not say anything. But since they're trying to solve the problem, we believe that whenever there is a performance output, it'll be followed by everybody evaluating it. And unit evaluation just means it's an evaluation of one performance output. Good idea, bad idea. And you see that strongly in Bale's categories 3 and 10, which is agrees, shows passive acceptance, understands, and disagrees, shows passive rejection, formality, withholds help. As I say, it may be private. The person may not communicate it. In fact, most of the performance outputs, unit evaluations, are not publicly communicated, because in a group of, say, 8 people, you can't have 7 people saying good, bad, but we believe they think it, and some of them may choose to say it. And then there's agreements and disagreements. Agreement and disagreement you can see most clearly if 2 people make performance outputs at the same time and the performance outputs are different. If one person says, I think we ought to review the material before we start, and somebody else says, I think it would be more sensible to start talking about the problem, then you got a disagreement. So if there's a disagreement, it always has to be resolved. Why does it have to be resolved?
So closer to the solution, you can't.
Yeah.
Proceed.
And it's a collective task. If we disagree, that can't go on very long because we're not going to come up with a single answer. So disagreements are going to have to be resolved. And you see those in categories 3 and 10, which also look like unit evaluations. So it'll be simpler if we talk about those categories of interaction. And you can imagine those categories of interaction apply not only to discussion groups, but to almost any task-focused, collectively oriented group. Right? Think of a basketball team. You throw the ball to somebody, you're giving him an action opportunity, or her. And if the person takes the action opportunity, tries to make a basket, that's a performance output. And everybody watches it and forms unit evaluations. So any task-focused, collectively oriented group, their interaction can be described in those terms. Okay, so far? One new term. And that term is expectations, which you will know very well in a week or two. An expectation we usually define as an anticipation of the quality of a person's performance output. So if I hold high expectations for somebody in my group, that means I have a hunch that the next thing she says is going to be good. Or if I have low expectations for somebody in my group, that means I have a hunch the next time he says something, it's going to be a waste of time. Not always conscious. I don't think people go around in these groups trying to decide she's the smartest, he's the next smartest, he's the next smartest. I don't think they do that. But you can still talk about these things even if they're not always conscious. And usually they're relative to pairs of actors. It's not so much that I think she's really good at everything, it's just I think that she's better than she is. Or I think he's better than she is. It's always a relative thing. Yeah. So if you think about a Bales group, you say, well, it's not, they probably don't say, I think she's really good at everything, because they're not really concerned with that problem. What they probably say, if you ask them to make it conscious, is, I think she had the best ideas in our group for that problem. Where does expectations come from? They come from the unit evaluations. Unit evaluations generalize into performance expectations, which means if I'm in a discussion group like this and somebody says something and I think she's right, and then she says something else and I say she's right, and she says something else and I think she's right, at some point that generalizes into I think she knows how to do this. And it works the other way too. She says something and I think that's not helpful. She says something else and I think bad idea. She says something else, I think nope. Eventually I think she doesn't understand how to do this task. So at some point a series of unit evaluations generalize into a performance expectation. And once I form them, the world looks different, because not only do I think she had good ideas, but I think the next thing she says is likely to be useful. Or not only do I think she has bad ideas, but I think the next thing she says is going to distract us.
Question.
Yeah.
So does that coincide with like the whole idea of persistence in these task groups, or is that completely separate?
We're going to come up. I'll do persistence in a few minutes. Give me a few minutes. What I hope to do here is to introduce the idea of the formation of expectations as a consequence of the unit evaluations. What I was describing, of course, is an ideal situation. I mean, you're not in a group where you think every single thing he says is good. But it's sort of a ratio. If most of them are good and a few of them are bad, it'll take a little longer, but I can still form high expectations for him. If most of what she says is bad and a little bit of it's good, I can still form low expectations for her, but it takes a little longer. And we don't need to worry about how long it's going to take. All we need to know is they seem to be able to do this within the first few minutes of interaction. So remember, a unit evaluation always follows a performance output. Sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private. But the unit evaluations generalize into performance expectations for a person. Question?
I have another question.
Yes.
So if somebody comes in...
I work for you. Ask questions.
Yeah, so somebody can't come into the room with expectations, is what you're saying?
No, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, but
Okay.
let's presume, just to simplify situations, that when you set up this task-focused, collectively oriented discussion group, they're all unfamiliar with each other. They know nothing about each other. So, and that was true in the Bales groups. And that's what makes it so striking that they develop inequality, because they look so similar at the beginning. So we know the inequality is being developed from their interaction process. Nothing about them. But yeah, we'll come into other cases where it goes faster. So now we can look at the interaction sequence. And this means a very, very simplified idea about what's going on in these groups. Let's say you can look at their interaction as a series of sequences. Each sequence begins with an action opportunity. Somebody gives somebody else a chance to perform. Maybe asking who has good ideas, or what do you think, or I haven't heard what you say. Or simply, you stop talking and stare at the person. There's a lot of ways to give action opportunities. But let's assume an action opportunity starts. It's very likely to be followed by a performance output. You ask somebody what she thinks ought to be done. She's very likely to tell you. She may not. I mean, she could reject it. If she rejects it, it starts over. Somebody else gets an action opportunity. Performance output's always followed by a unit evaluation. For simplicity, we'll say they're either positive or negative. Always occurs. Maybe public, maybe private. Agreement or disagreement when you have conflicting performance outputs. And agreement and disagreement have to be resolved too. And if there's a disagreement, there has to be influence. Somebody has to say, I think you're right and I was wrong. Or, I think I'm right and you were wrong. Because they can't go on until they resolve their disagreements. So, if you have conflicting performance outputs, you have negative unit evaluations. That's the sequence of interaction. That's the full sequence. You may not go through the whole step. If you don't go through the whole step, it starts over again. So it's just a way of looking at what they're doing when they're working on the problem. They're going through this sequence of interactions. Okay so far? Okay, this one I didn't post. Another way to look at it. You start out with performance expectations. Performance expectation. No, block this part out. We'll do that later. Start out with an action opportunity. Action opportunity leads to a performance output. Performance output gets either a positive or negative unit evaluation. If there's a positive unit evaluation, there's some possibility that the person will form high expectations for the guy who got the positive evaluation. Or just say, I still don't know how much ability this guy's got. And the same thing happens with negative unit evaluations. There's some possibility to form negative performance expectations. He doesn't understand this. And some possibility that you're not ready to make a decision. But if you see this going on through repeated cycles, eventually you're going to have performance expectations formed for people. If you've already formed performance expectations for people, what does that do? Well, that makes it more, let's say I've formed high expectations for somebody. That makes it more likely I'll try to give that person action opportunities. I want to hear him. Suppose he's formed high expectations for himself too. Well, that means if I give him an action opportunity, he's very likely to take it. He's very likely to make a performance output. And finally, it means if I've formed high expectations for him and he's formed high expectations for himself, his performance output sounds a little bit better. More likely to get a positive unit evaluation. Same thing works the other way. If I have formed low expectations for somebody, whatever that person says doesn't sound as good as before I formed those expectations. More likely to get a negative unit evaluation. So if I have no performance expectations, we'll go through the sequence until I get them. Once I've got them, it'll bias the interaction. The higher the performance expectations attached to a person, the higher the performance expectations that I have for a person, the more likely I am to give that person an action opportunity, the more likely that person is to make a performance output, and the more likely that person is to get a positive unit evaluation. sound okay? Thank you. I want to introduce the idea of theoretical construct. Theoretical construct means something that is useful to talk about, but you can't see it or feel it or touch it. And when I try to explain, and that's what expectation states are. When I try to explain the idea of theoretical constructs, I usually tell people, think about the idea of a conscience. If you say somebody has a well-developed conscience, you can't see it or feel it or touch it, but that helps you make predictions of how they're going to act. And that's what a performance expectation is like. You can't see it or touch it, but it helps you predict how the person's going to act. It's a task-specific, person-specific ability conception. And it's usually not conscious. I don't think people in these groups say, okay, now I know who had good ideas. No. If you give them a questionnaire, they can think about it and they'll probably come up with answers. But they don't usually behave that way, I think. So to go back to our ideas of the subtasks, remember one of the subtasks was to figure out who's going to be useful in this group. To say the same thing slightly differently, a subtask is to form performance expectations and to attach them to everybody, including to myself. And how do they get formed? From the pattern of unit evaluations and influence. So if you think about interaction, think about it as having action opportunities, performance outputs, unit evaluations, agreement, disagreement, and influence. Those are the components of interaction. And now I can say the expectations that people form will govern the distribution of all of the components of the power and prestige structure. The higher the expectations I hold for somebody, the more likely I am to give that person an action opportunity, the more likely he or she is to accept it and make a performance output, the more likely he or she is to get a positive unit evaluation, to exert influence if somebody disagrees, to be thought of as having leadership and competence. So all of these things are the components of the power and prestige structure. And in the boards of directors study, what you saw, I think, is that the interaction process becomes very orderly once expectations form. People decide whom they want to encourage to talk and whom they want to discourage. And when everybody has formed expectations for everybody, that'll govern the way they continue their interaction. It becomes much more orderly. There's no more competition, or much less competition. There's much less uncertainty, and it just goes through the problem. Once the power and prestige structure emerges, it tends to be stable. Remember that? Question is, why does it tend to be stable once it emerges? Why isn't it always changing? And the answer is what?
It feels like it's about efficiency. I mean, because once you made a decision, you're just kind of sticking with that, even though it's not conscious.
Yes, sir.
We've already got important opinions of people, so we can just go with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but why is it they don't change very often? The answer, I think, is that once the expectations exist, they affect the conditions that created them. So the higher the expectations I hold for you, the more likely am I to think that anything you say sounds good. Positive unit evaluation. Positive unit evaluations are what create high expectations. Just like negative unit evaluations create low expectations. So one of the reasons that you get this stability when the power and prestige structure has emerged, I think the main reason, is that the expectations that are produced the power and prestige structure are affected by some of the things that they create.
So like confirmation bias, really?
Yeah, you can call it that if you want to.
In a sense.
Yeah. Next week we'll study expectations in schools. If you're a good student when you were in school, you probably remember a time. If you were a good student in school, in our terms, that would mean the teacher held high expectations for you. There was probably a time when the teacher asked a question and you answered it, and it was not a really good answer, but the teacher said, "That's right." There was another kid in your class that everybody thought was dumb. In other words, they had formed low expectations for that kid. That kid said something, may have not been all that bad. Teacher said, "Wrong." So what you're seeing there is the distribution of evaluations being biased by the expectations that exist. And that's why the power and prestige structure tends to be stable once it emerges. So now we have an explanation for our four generalizations. Why do those things happen? Those things happen because what happens during the interaction is people form performance expectations for themselves and everybody else. And once they form those performance expectations, that affects the interaction process so that you get this inequality and it tends to persist. That's our explanation. Any questions on our explanation? I only have a couple more things I want to offer you. The simplest way to think about performance expectations is to think about them applying to... Your chiropractor wouldn't like you doing that. Your chiropractor would not like you doing that.
It hurts.
Yeah.
Can you help me?
I can't do it. I don't know chiropractic. All I know is they don't like it if you pop your own neck. They would like to do it for you.
I have 5 herniated discs.
Wow. Chiropractor can't do much for that. It's fairly simple if you think about performance expectations. Remember I said they're relative to people, to pairs of people. So you can think about really the way it looks to somebody in the group is not so much that I'm trying to get the whole structure here, but if I hear her say something and him say something, I have differential expectations for the two of them. So the expectations can be applied to pairs of people. And in a two-person group, of course, it's very easy to see them. But an easy way to write them is to say we'll take into account the self-other expectations for every pair of interactants in the group. And we'll write them so that the expectations for self come first and the expectations for other come second. So this represents a situation where I have unformed expectations for myself. I don't know how well I can do it. And I have unformed expectations for him. I don't know how well he can do it. That's what it's like at the beginning of interaction. Everybody starts out there. Or let's presume they do.
That's what I'm having a hard lead right now, because I feel like people walk in the room with some expectations. But I know we're going to get that.
Well, in Bale's case, yeah, I mean, he started out with Harvard students who are very competitive and think they're smart. And that's why you get a status struggle. They're all trying to say, I've got really high expectations for myself. This is high expectations for self, low expectations for other. Just relative. Low expectations for self, high expectations for other. High expectations for self, high expectations for other. We're both very good at this. Low expectations for self, low expectations for other. Neither of us knows how to do this. So those are the possible patterns. In the simplest case, we say people start out here and they move into these, usually into these two, but you can imagine cases where they're in those two. And sometimes it helps, I think, to say, well, what does the world look like as a consequence of the expectations you formed in these groups? Well, if you're in this state, that's where we presume you usually start. There's a certain amount of anxiety because you're working on a task and you don't really know who's going to be able to contribute here. Not even sure you're going to be able to do it or get an answer for the group. You start looking for clues. Try to figure out. She seems confident, or he told me he had taken a class that was relevant to this topic. You start looking for clues. He answers questions quickly. Well, maybe he knows what he's talking about. He hesitates a long time before he answers. Maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. You start looking for clues. And you see at the very beginning when they're here, lots of action opportunities being given out. It's as though people are trying to figure out how good are the ideas each person has. And there's lots of performance outputs going out too, because they haven't yet figured out whether I know how to do it. Somebody asks a question, I'll try to answer it. So it's a state of anxiety because you really don't know how you're going to proceed until you can sort of figure out who do you want to listen to and who do you want to shut up. That's how I think it feels when you don't have useful expectation information. High self, high other, those are contentious. You get a lot of arguments. I think I'm really good at this. You think you're really good at this. I think you should be treating me deferentially. You think I should be treating you deferentially. You probably find the people who are highly task-focused. Each of us wants to solve this problem and do it before the other guy does to show that I'm smarter than he is. You see lots of performance outputs. You don't see a lot of action opportunities. That's what it looks like, I think, in what Bales called the status struggle. You got a group of people who all think, I'm good at this, and I think the other guy is good at this too, but I'm going to show him I'm better. Low self, low other. Those are really unpleasant situations. We're in a group, we're supposed to solve a problem. I have no idea how to do it, and I don't think you do either. What are we going to do? That is really unpleasant. And usually what people try to do is to withdraw psychologically. You start going through your shopping list mentally. Or you say, the heck with this problem, this isn't important anyhow. Let's talk. If you see a group where there's low self, low other, you find very low rates of interaction. They sort of sit there, they stare at the floor. They lose task focus. I don't know how to do this, you don't know how to do this, the heck with it, we're not going to work on it. Because we're not going to succeed. Whatever we come up with, they're not going to think it's a good answer. And when that happens in Bales discussion groups, they usually end the discussion early. He says you've got 45 minutes to discuss it. After 15 minutes, they say, we're done. I'm just trying to provide a phenomenological feel for what it looks like.
otherwise known as Thursday?
Thursday. Differentiated states. Most of the time you get differentiated states here. High self, low other. Well, I feel confident. When I say something, I think it sounds right. And in fact, the way I say it even changes. If I'm high self, low other, I tend to talk louder, faster, using bigger words. You'll see that phenomenon later. This is what business people call proactive. I would say there's a lot of performance outputs here. Partly, I make a lot of performance outputs because I think I'm right, and partly you let me do it because you don't think you're right. Get more task focused as I get more confident I know what I'm doing. But this kind of person can antagonize others because he or she is usually dominating the interaction. And yes?
Can you repeat the proactive?
Yeah, well,
You were saying like the REM, I guess I lost track of that.
I use that term because they love it in business. Proactive means you are offering suggestions very quickly without even people saying, I'd like to hear your opinion. Because I've decided I know how to do this better than he does, so I'm going to start talking. What was I saying about? Oh, you can antagonize others. You remember in the Bales groups, the person who talked the most and had the most influence was not the best liked. And that makes sense. If somebody thinks he's the best, and other people think that too, he's doing a lot of things like, just be quiet, you're wasting time. Or, I'll tell you how to do this, just listen to me. So there's a lot of that, and that can irritate people. But somebody who is at the top of the inequality structure is very likely to be doing things that will antagonize others. They're not going to love him. They may say, I respect him, but I sure don't like the guy. So, this one, I don't know how to do this, but I'm pretty sure you do. That person becomes very reactive, the opposite of proactive. Person waits to be told what to do. If you're on a committee with somebody like this, low self, high other, that person is going to drown you in questions. Wait a minute, I have another question about how to do this. Many action opportunities. I don't want to say anything because you'll realize I don't understand it. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think? These people tend to emphasize social emotional acts. They encourage others. Somebody says something, they say, yeah, good idea. Or they notice somebody's getting a little irritated or being left out. They say, I'd like to hear what you think about these things. They're friendly, they're supportive. Usually the number 2 person is the best liked in these groups. Because the number 2 person has said, well, compared to the top guy, I don't really have to run this thing. I can say nice things to people. And they do. What I hope you saw in the last 2 slides is sort of a phenomenological feel, how these expectation states feel, as well as how they look if you're watching them from the outside as an observer. Does that help? Maybe not. What should I say more of? Okay, quick summary and a preview. What I wanted to do is to explain those 4 propositions on interaction. Wanted to emphasize there's scope conditions, meaning We can explain what goes on as long as it's a task-focused, collectively oriented situation. Does the explanation apply if it's not task-focused, collectively oriented? I don't know. It may or may not. But it should apply whenever it's task-focused, collectively oriented. The explanation is inequality develops as a result of people forming performance expectations. And they form performance expectations because they think one of their subtasks is to figure out who can help us here and who's going to waste our time. Once they've formed, they govern the distribution of all the components of the inequality structure. Interaction creates differentiated expectations because of the unit evaluations. And expectations, once they form, tend to be stable because they affect the conditions that led to them. Remember, expectation states are a theoretical construct. We're going to talk about them all the time as if they're real, but you can't hold them in your hand or touch them. And people, by and large, are not conscious of forming them. If you interview them at the end of the group and say who had the best ideas, they can probably answer it, but they tend not to think about that while they're doing it. And if you control the interaction process, you can control the expectation formation. And if you control the expectation formation, then you control the subsequent interaction, right? Any questions on any of that? Quick preview for Thursday.